But recently, because of the whole craziness of people overbuying products and going to the shopping centres and clearing them out and all that kind of stuff, I don't know about you, but I started to look at our fridge and kind of see what we had left. You know, you kind of want to hold off on going to the supermarket for as long as possible. There's that sense in which it's like, well, maybe if I go later, the craziness will be over. I don't know if you felt that, but I certainly felt that. And so as I started looking through my fridge, I started to look for the use-by dates on things. You know, you kind of journey through and you'd be like, okay, tomato sauce, still got 2 months on that. We're still good to go. Cheese is gone. Milk is gone. You know, and you start to kind of clear out. It makes it sound like our fridge is really dirty. I promise it isn't. But you start looking at these use-by dates and kind of going, hey, is this going to survive this present crisis? And it got me thinking about use-by dates and the significance of use-by dates. Because the idea that products have a use-by date is something that we come to understand, you know. If something goes out of date or too far out of date, it starts to go sour. It starts to not work the way that it should, not taste the way that it should, not be experienced the way it was created to be experienced. And the same is true when it comes to conflict, which is what I'm going to talk about tonight. And this is the big idea that I want to stress to us all. This is the big takeaway, is that all conflict has a use-by date. All conflict has a use-by date, and that will make a bit more sense as I unpack this. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Simon Duke spoke in our PM service around what motivates our conflict. And essentially, at a base level, it's when we don't get what we want. James chapter 4 makes that very clear. We get into areas of conflict because we just don't get what we want. And so usually we're pretty aware of when we find ourselves in those places of conflict. But sometimes while we're aware of the conflict, we're not actually ready to deal with the whole forgiveness thing. It's like that kind of feels like it's a step too far. And so we find ourselves kind of caught between these 2 points, where one, we know we have been offended or we've offended somewhere else. And then at the end of the day, we know that Jesus' command for us is to forgive, and yet it still feels kind of harsh. You know, it still hurts too much. We know what we need to do, but we don't want to go there yet. And so tonight, I suppose, or this afternoon, I want to talk about what we do when we find ourselves trapped in that middle zone between feeling offended and yet we're not quite ready to really fully forgive someone yet. Maybe we've had bad experiences of forgiveness in the past. Maybe we've been hurt again and again and we're just not ready to go there. But whatever reason we have, we're not ready to go the full hog. And the good news is that Jesus still has so much to share with us around what it looks like to find ourselves in this middle position. So if you have your screens, if you don't mind moving away from the Twitch feed, or if you've got a second device, feel free to move with me to Matthew chapter 5, because here we see Jesus speaking into this concept that is so critical to us. I've got it on the screen. I'm just going to switch it up here so you guys can see it too. So reading from Matthew chapter 5, 21 to 22, it says, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.' But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, 'Raka,' is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in danger of the fire of hell." Wow, that's a pretty kind of confronting passage there. I mean, you start off with this whole "you shall not murder," and we all know that murder is a bad thing. But then it kind of progresses to anger, which kind of hits a little bit more at home because we all know what it feels like to be angry. But then suddenly Jesus seems to jump straight into like the fires of hell. Like, where did that possibly come from? You know, like it feels like a pretty massive step, at least at face value. And so we got to ask the question, why is conflict, why is anger and our frustration such a big deal, and why does Jesus want to speak into it? Well, first of all, it's because Jesus, as he says over and over again throughout his teachings, the issue with anger and the issue with conflict is that it's a heart issue, right? This isn't just an actions issue. This isn't just about the fact of what happened. Anger and conflict and the kind of relationships that we have with each other is actually a heart issue that we have to deal with. And if we're not careful, our heart can be seriously damaged and not operate the way that God created it to operate. It's almost like Jesus is wanting to tell us and say, I don't want you to experience this type of conflict. I want you to experience this type of anger because you weren't designed to experience this conflict and anger. And so when we see this word, it's like even if you tell your brother or sister raka, which is basically, it's like a Hebrew word for worthless. It means that you're calling someone worthless, right? He's saying even if you do that, call someone worthless, you're in danger of the fires of hell. It's like there are significant consequences to what is going on there, and in the way that you relate to others. You know, it might start small. This small little conflict, it might start as something little, but you are actually playing with fire. You are actually playing with fire. This is what Jesus wants to talk about. It's like when you talk about conflict, you're actually talking about playing with fire. Now, I've got a little prop here. I've got some milk. Now, I don't know about you, I love milk. If you've heard many of my sermons before, you'll know I seem to talk about milk a lot because I really, really like milk. And I don't know if you're about me, I wake up in the morning and I like to get my cereal out, you know, and so I kind of, you know, put my Sultana bran or whatever is going on that particular day in my bowl. And of course I go to the fridge and check the milk. Now, sometimes the milk will be a little bit like this. Now, I'm going to put that closer to the camera. You can see that there's only a little bit left there, just a couple of centimeters. And when there's only a couple of centimeters, you're a little bit more suspicious, right, of exactly how old the milk is. So occasionally I'll look for that use by date that I was talking about before, and I'll notice, or maybe it's the day of use by, you know, maybe it's the day after. And I know we've probably all found ourselves in this position, whether it's with milk or something else, and we look at that use by date and we go, oh, I wonder if it's still okay. I wonder if it's still okay. And so we do the three-phase test. This is what we do. So first of all, we take the lid and we do the sniff test, right? So we have a sniff and we go, it smells all right, you know. It smells all right. It should be okay, and I think we're okay from here. So then we progress to stage 2, which is the sip test. And so we take a little sip. I'm not going to take a sip out of this one. And we make a judgment. We go, oh yeah, I think it's going to be okay, you know. But then there's a third phase of the test, of course, which is the pour. And when we start to pour out the milk, and rather than coming out as a nice, smooth stream, chunks fall into our cereal and our bowl, right? We know that something has gone terribly, terribly wrong, right? Milk should not have texture, all right? And so we know that when those chunks start to flow and they hit our cereal, and we know that that cereal is a lost cause, it ain't going in my mouth any longer, we know that this thing is far past its use by date. If you are eating milk instead of drinking milk, something is wrong. And this is exactly the same thing that happens when it comes to conflict in our lives. When we leave things too long, right? When we leave bits of conflict, even small little bits of conflict in our life, too long, they start to fester. They start to go bitter. They start to go sour. And things aren't as they were intended to be. And it starts to affect our heart. And so that image of that milk coming out of that container and flowing into that cereal, I want you to remember that disgusting image, because the truth is all conflict has a use by date. All conflict has a use by date, okay? And it's so important to remember this, because with all conflict having a use by date, it means that if I don't deal with it, if I just leave things as they are, there is this incredible potential for that conflict to go sour and for it to affect my heart. And Jesus doesn't want this for us. And this is why he stresses it so hard in Matthew chapter 5. It's like, even if you say that someone is worthless, you're in danger. You're in danger of the fires of hell, because something bigger is actually going on. And so I want you to remember this. Whether you are the offender or the offended, all conflict has a use by date. I'm going to continue as we dig into this a little bit deeper. Now in Matthew chapter 5, continuing on from his warning around the fires of hell, he continues in this way. And this is particularly a message for the offender. That is, if you are the person who has offended somebody else. It says this in Matthew chapter 5. I'll put it on the screen as well. It says, therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you. So they've got something against you. That means you did something to them and they're holding something against you. Leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to them. Then come and offer your gift. So remembering, this is instructions for those who are the offender. Now, we know that we offend people at times. Maybe we have a statement or we say something that's offensive. Perhaps we act in a way that is just not in line with Jesus, and people get offended. Sometimes we don't mean to offend them, but they get offended anyway. But nevertheless, in that moment, we are the offender. And fascinatingly, what Jesus says in this passage is to leave your offering, your gift, at the altar. Now, this was a really significant statement to make, particularly for his audience of really principled and pious people of the Jewish faith, because offering your gift at the altar, offering your sacrifice or your offering at the altar was about being reconciled with God. It was about forgiveness between you and God. And there was nothing that they would fear more than obviously not being right with God. And so Jesus uses this illustration of like someone coming to go get right with God. And he essentially like turns it on its head, because the natural assumption is that we ought to get right with God. That has to be the priority. And of course, it is important. And yet what Jesus does in this moment is something that just would blow the mind of his hearers of the day. And that is, he flips the priority in that moment and says, I know that in that moment you might be going and offering your offering to God. You might try to be getting right with God, and that is really important. But don't do it if somebody has something against you. If you have offended someone and you haven't dealt with that, then actually deal with that first. And it can kind of almost rub the wrong way a little bit as followers of Jesus. We're like, really? Is that really what Jesus is asking us to do? And yet it's there, so clear. If you are offering your gift at the altar and remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar, go and be reconciled to them, and do that first. And that's the key word, first, all right? And so there's this shift in priorities that Jesus wants us to embrace, because he knows that conflict is a heart issue. He knows that all conflict has a use-by date. And if it is left unaddressed, even if it is left unaddressed because we feel like we're getting right with God and therefore other people don't matter, it's going to fester. It's going to go sour. And it's not going to end up. And so we have here Jesus talking about this holistic gospel that isn't just about our relationship with God, even though that is incredibly critical and the most important thing. It's actually this holistic gospel which is about our relationship with other people, our relationship with the earth, and our relationship with our inner self, the kind of stuff that's going on inside of us. I remember it was quite a few years ago now. I was running an Easter camp, and I was actually, it was a winter camp. Sorry, it was in the middle of the year. It was a winter camp at Crossway, and it was my responsibility. It was getting pretty late. It was kind of 11:30, maybe even midnight, and some of the kids, some of the youth hadn't gone back to their dorms and gone to sleep. In fact, they were making a bit of a racket, and so I was there, kind of acting as the person who came in with a heavy word, kind of gave them a bit of a yell and said, kind of go to bed. Anyway, so I was kind of wandering around these rooms, and there was this group of Year 12 guys who just were chatting away, and they weren't really respecting others. And so I came into the room pretty hot. I came in hot. I'm like, all right, guys, time to go to bed. And they started to protest, because there was actually a youth leader in there, a really well-respected youth leader, who I later learned had kind of said, hey, guys, let's do this special thing around prayer and around connecting with each other. And anyway, but I came in hot. I said, no, it's not going to happen. It's time for bed. It's time to shut down. Anyway, and so, of course, the Year 12s, they did what they were told, but essentially what I'd done in that moment is I'd essentially humiliated this youth leader. I hadn't done it intentionally, but at the same time, I'd humiliated him. He'd kind of said that he was going to do something, and then I came in with kind of brute force, and I had offended him. And I remember kind of coming out of that room, and that leader kind of following me, and we kind of split paths for a little while. And I remember trying to justify things in my mind. I was like, no, I had to do that. It was my responsibility, and I did the right thing, okay? And we can do this sometimes with conflict. We try to justify our actions even though there is still offense that has taken place. And I started to think about it for a while, and then I was like, you know what? Actually, I can't leave this unresolved. And so I remember going back to that leader, having a chat with him, apologizing for how I went about doing what I did, and apologizing for having humiliated him. And we were able to have a conversation. I think we pretty much resolved things. Of course, it probably still hurt him a little bit, but at the same time, I tried to make the effort. Now, you might kind of say, well, Gavin, that's a pretty kind of simple example, and it is. But that's the whole point. It's usually these like simple points of conflict that are the ones that can fester, the ones that we leave unaddressed. And sometimes what happens is they build up over time, right? They build up over time. And it's like, I've got down here, it's like what happens is we do something offensive, and I've got this great, look at this used by stamp. We do something offensive to someone else, whether we mean to or not, and it's like in that moment, the stamp goes down, right? And the use by date is listed, and it's there on a page with us having offended someone, and it's like the clock starts ticking. It's like from now on, all right, I've got to decide what I'm going to do about this conflict, because it's got a use by date. It's going to fester unless I do something about it. And so that offense happens, and boom, it goes again, right? Another use by date. And Jesus says, I don't want your life to end up like this, with a lot of offense and nothing addressed. And so whether it be simple things or big things, we need to make peace a priority. Yes, it takes humility, but this is about the heart, okay? It's about the heart. So the first thing that Jesus wants to tell us through Matthew chapter 5 is if you are the offender, okay, if you are the offender, make peace a priority. Make it a priority, because all conflict has a use by date. Okay, so this was a message for the offenders who are going to offer their sacrifice, their offering at the temple, and it's certainly a message for us today as we go to church or as we seek to engage spiritually. You might be coming to your devotional time of a day, and you remember that a brother or sister has something against you, and you may be putting it off because you're not ready for forgiveness. Maybe you just forgot about it, and it only just sprung to mind. Well, Jesus would say, leave your offering. First, go and be reconciled. First do that, then come back and offer your gift, okay? So it's not like we're just doing what we're doing for others. He says, first, change your priorities, then come back and offer your gift, because this is to do with your heart. So we've got this message about all conflict having a use by date if you are the offender, and actually not very far on in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus switches gears and he starts to talk about the fact that some people in the area of conflict are not the offender, but they are the offended. Okay, they are the people for whom something occurred to them. And the same truth about conflict having a use by date is true if you are the offended as well. I'm going to continue to read here from Matthew chapter 5. This is just a little bit further onward. It says in verse 43, you have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good. He sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. So this is a message for the offended, all right? So you might be in this situation hearing this live stream message tonight, and you're like, man, I'm not the offender. In fact, actually, the kind of stuff that's taking up headspace right now is that I was offended. I went shopping, and I wanted that soup, and someone stole it out from under me, and I was offended, and I'm still holding that grudge. You know, that's another simple example, but whatever it is, you felt offended because something happened to you. Well, this passage, this instruction of Jesus is for you. And again, I just want to make this clear. This isn't me just kind of going, hey, here's some of Gavin's good ideas. I'm literally reading what Jesus taught his followers and the crowds here in Matthew chapter 5. So in the Greek, this word for love your enemies, the word is ekthros, or enemies. And this is a personal word, okay? This is a personal word. This is not about just being offended generally by the state of society. The enemy was somebody who was close to you, right? Or somebody that you knew, right? And had that kind of that face-to-face feel about. The enemy was someone who offended you closely. And so Jesus is talking about love your enemies. In fact, it had been taught by the rabbis other ways. It says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. This is how it had been taught. But he's saying, a new command I give you, love your enemies. Love your echthros. Love these people who offend you. And while that word enemy, right, I don't want that to act as a barrier, because sometimes we go like, well, I don't have any enemies. Like, I don't have a list of enemies that I'm just like, oh, I just don't like these guys. Usually we don't have those for the most part, but we do have people who offended us. Our brother or our sister or our parent or our teacher. We have people who offended us in some way. We felt wronged, right? We didn't get what we want, reflecting back on James 4 and Simon's message. We didn't get what we want, and therefore I am the offended person, and that is where I find myself. And so Jesus, rather than saying, well, you're well within your rights to be offended and you should just stay where you are, make sure you fester, make sure that kind of, sours up inside of you so you get bitter. Of course not. That's not what Jesus said at all. He said, love your enemies, love those who offended you, and pray for those who persecute you. Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear an instruction like this, my natural instinct is it's disgust, right? It's disgust. It's like, no, that's not how it should work, all right? That's not how it should work. We shouldn't be just letting our enemies get it. We shouldn't be praying for our enemies, right? They were the ones who did things to us. It's like I'm giving them a gift and they're giving me like rubbish. That doesn't make sense. And we actually, as followers of Jesus even, we just don't want it to be this simple. We don't want to follow this instruction of Jesus because it just doesn't seem logical. And yet, Jesus said, this is the way. This is the way to avoid the kind of use-by dates that are clicking forward day by day if we leave conflict unresolved. Now, it's interesting that Jesus says, pray for those who persecute you. Now, this is a really important thing to understand, because sometimes even as followers of Jesus, passionate and devoted followers of Jesus, we can pray about our enemies, right? So sometimes we kind of go, oh yeah, I need to pray about my enemies, and so we'll start praying. But usually those prayers mean, I pray that my enemy will have a shift in perspective. I pray that they will know that they hurt me. I pray that, we pray those kind of things, but that's not what Jesus says. In fact, Jesus says he wants us to pray for our enemies, not for what they want to occur. That's very different. But pray for them. That is, pray for their blessing, pray for their insight, pray for their understanding, pray for their generosity. Pray that people of influence would rise up around them, right? So that they could be influenced in the ways of Jesus. Actually want good for your enemies. And that is so offensive, right, to our sensibilities. And yet this is what Jesus says. He says, all conflict has a use-by date. This is about the state of your heart. And if you find yourself in the offended category, don't just stay there. Don't do nothing. There is something practical that you can do right away, and that is pray for your enemies, even though it doesn't feel fair. The fascinating thing that we see in this passage is that when we pray for our enemies, Jesus actually makes a parallel between when we pray for our enemies and when God, that is our Father in heaven, causes his Son to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. It's like he's saying to us, hey, God, our Heavenly Father, doesn't discriminate, okay? He doesn't discriminate. He sends sun to all. He sends rain to all, the righteous and the unrighteous. And when we choose to pray for our enemies, when we choose not to have that use-by date just continue to click closer and closer to the point of spoil, we are actually imitating God. We are actually reflecting the Father's heart. And so that is such a beautiful thing. It's an inspiring thing. It's like, this is how God operates. You ought to as well. And so when we find ourselves in this place of being offended, rather than just being a bit kind of like complainy or getting bitter or potentially trying to get revenge, which Meigs will talk about on our stream next week, Jesus says there is a practical thing that you can and should do, the kind of thing that reflects the heart of God, the kind of thing that will protect you from the fires of hell when it comes to your heart. He says, pray. Pray for those who persecute you. And Jesus on the cross even did this. Luke 23:34. Jesus on the cross, after being offended in the greatest possible way, accused of a crime he didn't commit, and then nailed to a cross, his crucifixion, he looks down and he says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." This prayer of understanding, this prayer of these poor people, they don't get it. They don't get it. And that's why they're doing this. So help them get it. Forgive them, Father. So when we do this, we imitate Jesus. And it's important to remember that Jesus doesn't say the persecution will stop. He doesn't say the persecution will stop just because we prayed for them. He says this isn't to do with actually them, and Megs again will talk about God's judgment next week, but this is actually about what it's doing to you. And what it's doing to you right now as the offender or the offended is deeply significant, and you need to deal with it. We all need to deal with it. So here's what we need to remember. If you are the offended, make peace a priority. If you are the offended, make peace a priority. So if you are the offender, make peace a priority. If you are the offended, make peace a priority, because all conflict has a use-by date. All conflict has a use-by date. So these are some simple instructions, simple but very difficult at the same time instructions that Jesus gives us. And I suppose today, I would love us to be able to respond really practically to these instructions of Jesus. Because we all walk around with use-by dates. Ways that we've offended others, ways that we have been offended ourselves. And again, we end up with these use-by dates. And if we don't do anything about them, then it's going to affect our heart. So if you find yourself in a situation where something has happened to you or you've done something to else and you're not ready to fully forgive yet, it's too raw, or perhaps you're not ready to have that conversation yet, or whatever it might be, and you kind of feel like you're trapped in the middle, today, heed the words of Jesus when it comes to conflict, because this is about the state of your heart. This is about playing with fire. And he says, you're no longer stuck. There is actually something you can and should do. You can do this immediately. You can do this while I'm live streaming. If you remember that you have offended a brother or a sister or whoever it might be, then action this now, okay? Because all conflict has a use-by date. Again, these aren't my wonderful insights. These are instructions from Jesus that, yes, are hard, but are deeply, deeply powerful when it comes to our walk with him. So if you are the offender, what do you need to do? You need to initiate through an apology. Initiate through an apology. It doesn't mean that it's going to fully resolve. It doesn't mean you're going to fully come back to where you were before, but initiate with an apology. Humble yourself and say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I did. Get specific as you can as the offender. It's a step in the right direction, and it's something that you can take today. Now, if you are the offended, and even with these really, really small things that we kind of say, oh, I'm bigger than that, I shouldn't have to deal with that, it's not a big deal. If you are offended in any way, then can I encourage you to follow the instructions of Jesus and pray for your enemy, pray for your adversary, pray for the one who offended you. Because if you do these things as the offender or the offended, you actually become a peacemaker. You become a proactive peacemaker, and something that Jesus deeply wants us to all experience. And so even right now, as you're watching this live stream, I encourage you, either bring a name to mind. If there's a name that just springs to mind that someone you have offended or someone who has offended you, write down their name. Write down their name, okay? Write down their name and be proactive around taking that step forward to ensure that that use-by date doesn't get closer and closer and ultimately affect your heart in a way that God never intended our heart to experience. So I'm going to pray, And as I pray, let's keep those names in mind. Let's be proactive, even in the midst of the chaos that we feel in our environment right now, to be peacemakers rather than being held and trapped by conflict. Let's pray. Jesus, I just want to thank you that even online we can gather, that we can learn. And God, while these instructions are simple at face value, we know they're very difficult to implement. And so God, would you give us courage and would you give us humility? We need both those things, God. Would you fill our heart with courage to step out, to pray for our enemies? Pray for those ones that we would rather not pray for, knowing that when we do so, we imitate you. And God, if we're the offender, if we have offended someone in a big way, in a small way, God, would you give us the humility to go and apologize? And while it seems like a simple step, it's one that we too often avoid. And yet, God, we don't want conflict to get hold of our heart. We don't want to writhe in bitterness. We want to reflect you as the one who forgives, as the one who shares, the one who loves, and the one whose heart is for all. And so, God, help us to reflect that as we navigate this tension of conflict in our world. In your name.